We're going to talk about electronic travel aids. Electronic travel aids have always had great potential, but really have not garnered the kind of acceptance that we would have expected. And there are various reasons for that, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do is go over some of the characteristics of devices, some of the history of past devices and their development, some of the current devices, and then we'll talk more specifically about their uses. So in regard to the characteristic of the devices, there are a number of different attributes that I want to talk about. The first one has to do with whether they are active or whether they are passive devices. Passive devices, as the name applies, really relates to whether or not the device collects ambient energy or produces its own energy. The passive devices collect ambient energy, so they receive existing information from the environment. It may be that they are gathering ambient light to give information about where somebody might be on a path, or whether there's an obstacle in front that might block out light. Or maybe it's ambient sound, amplifying sound reflections that might bounce from walls or buildings. Those would be passive devices. And those were the earliest devices. Then we move to the active energy radiating devices. And those devices emit their own energy. And there are two categories. One category is emitting light energy, another category is emitting sound energy. Those that emit light can emit different kinds of light. First of all, there's divergent light, which is the normal light that we would see coming out of a flashlight. And that light would bounce off of whatever might be in front and be received by the device and tell the individual that something is there. Another type of light is convergent light. And convergent light basically is narrowing light, very thin, pencil thin projections of light, which would be consistent with laser light. There's also infrared light, which is a different spectrum, a narrower spectrum than divergent light, and also has use, very good potential use. Okay, this brings us to sound energy. We certainly can have audible sound where the device emits something that we can all hear. It can be clicks, it could be tones, but that alerts everybody around the individual and maybe attracts a lot of attention to the individual. And then there's ultrasonic or higher sound that's so high that we can't hear it, possibly other animals could, for example like a dog whistle. If it's beyond 20,000 cycles per second, a dog can hear it, we can't. And the same with ultrasonic sound. We can't hear it, but it's there. Now that ultrasonic sound can be presented in different formats. One is pulse modulated, different pulses, but that has a more limited capacity for carrying information. Another form is called frequency modulated, where the frequencies that are sent out are different, and as they come back they're different. And so there's more information that can be contained in a frequency modulated system, and so more information about the environment can be conveyed. Now, in addition to that, I want to talk a little bit about the placement of the devices, or how the devices are mounted or worn. So, for example, a good number of the devices are handheld, and the person can scan with them using their hand, holding the cane in the other hand. Others are chest mounted, where they are around the neck and on the chest and protect the chest and face level. There are some that are head mounted that might be in spectacles. There are some that are artifact mounted. They could be, believe it or not, in pipes, in briefcases, a lot of different ways. And then there's also cane mounted, so that they are actually built into a cane and have a dual purpose. The cane still functions as it normally would as a probe and a sensor, but it has enhanced capabilities by having these devices built in. Another characteristic that I want to talk about is the means of display. It's possible that the information that's presented to the user could be in one of three formats. It could be tactile, could be a plunger that goes in and out at a specific rate, or it could be some kind of a vibrator that through the finger, the hand, the neck, what have you, that information can be provided in, at different rates to give different types of information. Or it can be sound. The sound can be generated through a speaker, full field, but then again, everybody hears it. Another approach is to have it go through an earphone. If it goes through an earphone, however, it could block out the ambient sound that people need, the traffic sounds that are very important. Or it could be something through an open ear mold, where it goes into the ear through an ear mold similar to what, a specially made ear mold similar to what a hearing aid user might use, but it has an opening in it so that ambient sound can also be heard. A third area, which is newer in many ways, is visual. And I'm not talking about through the eyes, but I'm talking about a direct connection with the occipital lobe. There have been experiments through the years where there's been a connection to the occipital lobe through electrodes, and that images can be formed not through the eyes but through the brain. And more we're seeing that possibly in the future as being potential. I also want to talk about a classification of the type of aid. It's possible to have a primary aid or a secondary aid. A primary aid is one that can be used in place of a cane or a dog guide. And to be a primary aid, it has to be able to sense obstacles in front of the individual, and it has to be able to also sense drop-offs or foot placement. Most typically, the aids that we see cannot do both of those things. The only time they can be a primary aid is if they're built into a cane. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the aids. A secondary aid, on the other hand, is a supplement to a cane or a dog guide, and is used with either of them. And so the majority, overwhelming majority, are secondary aids. So let's talk a little bit about the history of ETAs. After World War II, advances in technology paved the way for the development of electronic travel aids. The Wartime Office of Scientific Research and Development helped to create the National Research Council's Committee on Sensory Devices. And that committee helped to stimulate activity on ETAs and really facilitated development of research in a number of different facilities. The American Foundation for the Blind was one, National Research Council of Canada, Science for the Blind, MIT University, St. Dunstan's in London, Stanford Research Institute, University of Canterbury in New Zealand, Prosthetic and Sensory Aid Service of the VA, that was a very big one, and many independent vendors have tried to develop devices. Well, let's talk a little bit about the development of passive electronic travel devices. Over the years, between 30 and 40 of these devices have been developed. Most of them haven't had much staying power. They've come and they've gone. Some of that's been because the technology has advanced. For others, they just have not sold well. They haven't been accepted well. But we've seen the development of a lot of these devices. Early devices as we've mentioned, have obtained information by gathering ambient energy by passively responding to light or sound that is in the environment. One of the devices was called the passive optical spectacles, and it had photosensitive cells that changed light into audible sound. And I'll show you a picture of one shortly. In fact, I'll show you pictures of all of these passive devices. The BLESS, or Bishop Lucas Environment Sensor, was in the shape of a mail tube, the kind you'd use to mail a picture, so to speak, where you'd roll it up and put it in a tube. And it gave an auditory display relating to differences in light intensity regarding to where somebody might be in their position in the environment. Another one was the 80 or the 120 channel electrothalm. It was a tactile vision substitution system, and it used cameras to change light into a tactile display on an individual's forehead. And then finally there was the pan audio system, which used binaural hearing aids, which automatically increased their gain or their volume whenever there was a pulse of sound around, and that was to pick up any reflecting echoes that might be present. So let's take a look at pictures of some of these, or most of them. The BLESS, looking like a mail tube, looked something like this. And this is the set of spectacles that used cameras and transducers to change light into sound. And this is that electrothalm headband. You can imagine wearing that, how that would look to the outside world. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the development of active energy radiating ETAs. One was called the Witcher. It was made by MIT. It was a handheld device. It was mounted in an attaché case, and it scanned the environment by sending out a beam of light and transducing it into a tactile signal. And by mounting it in that briefcase-like housing, it was meant really to kind of disguise it. Kind of interesting. The G5, standing for Guidance Device 5, was another device, and it was a handheld device that used pulse light, which was detected by a photocell and transduced into a tactile stimulus. And this was the beginning of using light in a very specified way, and probably was the precursor to the latter devices, laser canes. I had the opportunity, when I first started in the field, of finding one of those older G5 devices, and you would hand hold it. It was like one of the very big lights that you might carry, 9-volt lights that you'd carry around in the dark. It was very big, and it would send out that signal. Another one was the Kohler sound generator. It was an early sonic active device which sent out energy in an audible range in the form of low and high frequency clicking, so that a person could hear the reflected sound. So it would actually generate clicking sounds. In some ways, it's similar to what we have seen, which is called palatal clicking, where somebody might go around going by clicking their tongue on their palate and creating these kinds of sounds. This was done, however, through this sound generating machine. In a similar way, a little different way, there was something called the Tversky tweeter, and it looked almost like a horn, a bicycle horn where you'd squeeze the bulb at the end of the horn, and it would send out a certain sound, and if you aimed it towards a wall, let's say in one direction, and you squeezed it, you could hear the wall because you could hear the echoes coming off of the wall. Some devices were developed that used pulse modulation, different pulses that they would send out. The Stromberg-Carlson was one, and the Hoover supersonic system was another one. And other devices used frequency modulated systems like we've talked about. One that I had a chance to use was the ultrasonic torch by Leslie Kay, and it was the precursor of the sonic guide, which we'll talk about very shortly. And eventually, one of the Kay device, sonar device that we also have available today. It was handheld and it sent out ultrasonic sound and gave the user a lot of information about what was available. Another one was the Westinghouse device that did something similar. Both of those devices sent out ultrasonic sound, so that sound wasn't audible to everybody around, but was transduced and came back to the individual in an audible fashion so that they could tell what was around them. So let's talk about some of the historical devices, but some that are a little bit more sophisticated than what we've been talking about. One of them was the C5 laser cane. And this evolved from I think the G5 device. And this used 3 low output gallium arsenide injection laser beams. Low output so that they wouldn't really be of harm to anyone. But those beams would scan the environment. One beam would go up, it would be head high. This would be built into the cane. Another one would be waist high and would go straight out. And then one would go downward to scan where the feet would be walking. The middle beam could be switched from a range of 5 feet to 12 feet for its sensitivity. And there was a photodiode in the cane that would pick up any returning light should those beams hit an object in front, and then translate that returning light into a vibrating tactile stimulus or an audible tone, and it could be controlled to be one or the other. The down beam was an interesting beam because the down beam, when the down beam didn't come back, it would signal the device to make a sound. Because if you think about it, if there's a drop-off, that down beam would go into the drop-off, but the edge of the drop-off would prevent the beam from coming back. And so it worked almost in the opposite fashion. And so it did pick up drop-offs, not 100% reliably, but not too bad if they were deep enough. All of the electronic components of that cane were in the upper section of the cane, so that if you hit something with the lower portion, you wouldn't damage the electronics. And you could even trail remotely by using it, by flipping your wrist, by turning your wrist a little. When you wanted to trail, the beams would trail a wall and tell you where that wall was. So an interesting device. Its initial cost was about $2,500. Expensive, especially in those days. Another device was the Russell Path Sounder, and it was a fairly big box. It was worn around the neck. It had a vibrator at the back of the neck, and it used ultrasonic sound pulses that were transduced into sounds or vibrations to the back of the neck, and it was designed to protect the chest from the waist on up and the head from obstacles. So in other words, it really complemented the cane, whereas the laser cane could be a primary aid in, because it had the electronics built into it. The path sounder had to be used with the cane, but it would protect the upper part of the body, so if you were walking towards tree branches or anything that was up high, it would let you know. And the intensity corresponded with the distance to the object. Also, we found that this was an excellent device to be used by users of wheelchairs, because they would have their hands that would manipulate the wheels, or they could have a powered chair where the device, the chair itself, would propel itself, but the upper part of the body would be protected by this device. Then we come to the sonic guide, and I talked about the K torch. It evolved into the sonic guide, and the sonic guide was spectacle mounted, and I will show you a picture of that shortly. and a very sophisticated device. Um, Frequency modulated with ultrasonic sound. It became commercially available in 1974-75. Had an ultrasonic transmitter and two receivers. All three of these were configured in the frame of a set of glasses. Um, and it had a power source and electronics in a control pack that was worn on the body. It sent a beam about 45 degrees to the left, 45 degrees to the right, so covering about 90 degrees, and the returning signal, the ultrasonic signal, would come back and be changed into an audible signal, and it could be presented through earphones or even open ear molds. And the signals vary according to the object being scanned, which was the major benefit of this device. Because it was frequency modulated, there was a tremendous amount of information that could be presented. I did a lot of training with this device. I taught students to use the device. I'll show you some pictures. You could walk along in the environment, and if there was a bush around you, you'd hear a mushy sound. If there was a hard object, a wall, a pole, you'd have a harder sound. If it was a glass, it would be even a harder sound. You could tell what objects were, you could identify, but it was almost like its own language, almost like a foreign language that you had to learn. It took a lot of training to be able to use it. It allowed for localization of objects exactly where they were because it was binaural, and almost the same way that we use headphones today or earphones, and you can tell where the sound is coming from. You could do the same thing with this device. But it was difficult to interpret and took a lot of training. The distance was interpreted by the changes in pitch. If the pitch was very low, it was getting very close, and when it got very close, it was ominous in terms of how low it sounded. One of the problems was that it would distract from environmental sounds, all of those other sounds coming through your ears. Another device was the Mowat sensor, and it was a little longer than a standard cell phone, maybe a little bit thicker than a standard cell phone, and it was a pulse-modulated ultrasonic handheld device, and it would vibrate in response to the presence of obstacles. The closer the object would be, the faster it would vibrate. It had a range of from 3.3 feet to 13 feet, and it could be used with an earphone as well if desired. And it was to be used in a back and forth scanning motion, so that almost like a scissors approach, where the cane would go in one direction, holding the cane, let's say in your dominant hand, cane would go in one direction, this would scan in the opposite direction. So you'd almost be doing like a scissors movement with it. So it was used more as a situational aid when you really wanted to know more information about the environment. It was one of the least expensive devices available. It came out at about $500 in the late 70s. Also had fun using that device from time to time. Okay, this is a picture of the sonic guide. Let me pick up my laser pointer. And right here, there are three sensors. There are emitters and receivers. There are two receivers and one emitter. And you can see that it's all built into the glasses, and that the earphones would come out of the back of the glasses. This is the source, the power source, and the electronics that you probably wear on your belt. And here's a picture of two of the students that I trained. These are my students in a shopping mall. And I think you might be able to see that she has the glasses on over a blindfold. Not very attractive with a blindfold. But she could tell exactly where the poles were, and she could actually do a slalom. She could go in and out of the poles without ever touching them, because the device gave you that kind of definition. Okay, this is another device that we'll talk about shortly, and it's called the Sonic Pathfinder. So hold on to that for a moment. We'll talk about it in just a while. Okay, some of the more current devices, and I would put the Sonic Pathfinder in that category, although it was one of the last devices before the more current devices. And it was a little bit different in that it used ultrasonic sound, but in many ways was more sophisticated because it would decide what was the most important sound for you to hear. And if there was an object in front of you, that's the sound you would hear. If there wasn't an object in front of you, it would give you information about what was on the sides. Okay, but let's talk about some of the more current devices. The Ultra Cane, a primary device because it had its electronics built into the cane. It's currently available. Uses ultrasonic sound to detect objects to the front and above the waist. It has 2 forward ranges from 6.5 feet to 13 feet. And it gives a lot of useful information. One of the problems is if you roll your wrist too much, you get information regarding what's on the side. So you really have to keep your hand in the center and your index finger up on the top. Another device, and I'll be showing you some pictures of all of these. Another device is the Mini Guide, and there were different versions of it. And the one that I like the best is the Mini Guide US, made to specifications by APH. And it could provide tactile or audible information. It's a handheld device, uses pulsed ultrasound, and it provides a range of from 1 to 5 settings, from maybe as close as a half a meter to 8 meters. And the closer the object, the faster the vibration or the chirping sounds that come out of it. And with a sweeping motion, you even get a change in pitch that tells you how close something is. Then we also have the Hand Guide. And this is a very interesting device and could be especially important for us. And I'll tell you about why. It uses infrared sensors at a distance of up to 4 feet. And that's its major limitation, is that it doesn't have much range. It's handheld. It comes with a belt clip to keep it on your belt while you're not using it. It is an audible chirping, and it has a tactile display as well. And those change as the objects become closer. But because of its 4-foot capacity, it's limited in finding landmarks until you get very close to them. Another thing is because it's infrared, it's optical, it doesn't detect glass. And so bus shelters, for example, it would not find. But it's very simplistic, it's very easy to use, and it's probably one of the best devices for children. And that's why I think we should be really thinking about that device. Another device is the K-Sonar device. It's a deviation of the sonic guide that I mentioned previously. Between the sonic guide and the K-Sonar device, there was something called CASPA, which was an improvement on the sonic guide. But the sonic guide never became very popular because it took so much training and it was hard to interpret, although people who used it could do marvelous things with it. So the K-Sonar device, instead of being this binaural device, is actually a monaural device. It's developed by Leslie Kay, K-A-Y. And it requires lateral scanning as you move. So it's got to go back and forth. It's not like a set of glasses. It's something you hold in your hand, or you can mount it on a cane, either one. It gives you low-pitched tones when objects are close, a higher generated pitch for objects that are farther away. The sound comes in to your ears through an earphone, and it gives you some localization ability. If you're pointing it directly at an object, it's louder. If you move it a little bit away from the object, it's softer. And it can impart characteristics of the object, just like the sonic guide could, through its tonal qualities. So again, that mushy sound for a bush, for example. It can be attached to a cane, and you can scan by moving the cane from side to side. But the device itself, it's recommended that the device is held rather than the cane, and that it be a little bit off-centered rather than centered in the middle. And so a lot of mobility specialists have really kind of dismissed it and really think that if it's to be used, it's really almost with the cane in one hand and holding this in the other hand and moving it from side to side, almost in that scissors effect, or it could be with the cane. And I'll show you a picture. And then finally, there's the N200 or 2000, I guess, laser cane, which is the 7th version of the laser C5 cane. And it's just a more sophisticated laser cane. And to be quite honest with you, I think if I had to choose a device myself to use, I might choose that laser cane. The pencil-thin beams that come out are very precise. It protects the upper part of your body. It finds obstacles in the middle. It does do some good work in terms of telling you well up ahead if there's a drop-off, if it's a deep enough drop-off. There are drawbacks. It doesn't detect glass very well. It has some problems in adverse weather. But it has a lot of advantages, and you can roll your wrist a little if you want to shoreline the wall. So it's a very interesting device. Okay, let's take a look at some of the pictures. These are together, grouped together, all of the pictures. First we have the hand guide, and then we have the mini guide, the US version, and this is the K sonar device. And you can see their size, in relation, and they're not terribly big. This is what the Ultra cane looks like. It's hard to see, but this is a cane, and this is the way that it's configured. And it's also a very good device to use. Much less expensive than the laser cane. Has a broader angle of information. And I'm not sure if it's still available or not. Up to a few years ago, it was the rage. We would see trainings taking place at all of the AAR conferences. But many of these devices are expensive to produce, and if not enough of them are sold, they do become obsolete and they disappear. This is the mini guide, and you can see how small it is. A nice choice to protect the upper part of your body, but you do have to hold it in your hand. You can certainly trail a wall with it easily. This is the hand guide, the one that I think is so good for kids. Okay, this is the K sonar device in use, and I think you can see on the right hand side, if you're holding it and it's attached to the cane, it's kind of an awkward way of using the cane. Doesn't work very well, I don't think. And you can see here how difficult it would be to actually use it in that way. But you can pull it off of the cane, and you can use it separately. Okay, I would like to talk about the information that the cane, not the cane, but the ETAs provide, and what some of the possible uses are and why they could be so useful and so helpful. So first of all, they provide protection from overhanging objects, and that's one of the major problems that we have with the cane, that the cane goes under objects and we can end up walking right into those objects if we're not careful. It's useful. It finds a wall ahead. You don't have to walk up to it. You know it's there. It's useful in finding an opening in a crowded area. We're going to find out as we go through the downtown travel. Getting through crowds sometimes can be a problem. Working within department stores can be a problem. A device like this can really be helpful. Following a line of people as the line moves forward. If you're in a bank line or you're in any kind of a line, in a cafeteria line, it's hard to know when to move ahead without touching the person in front of you. These devices tell you when somebody's moving. They can localize the position of an object so you know where something is that you want to find. You can find landmarks in that way. You can find poles. You can find an APS, especially if it's not doesn't have a tone locator. With some of the devices, that are ultrasonic and frequency modulated. You can determine the characteristics and identify what the objects are uh, without ever having to touch them. You can avoid pedestrians as you're moving around in a hallway. You can follow a wall and you can find openings. If you recall, there were so many times where we wanted to find specific openings in our hallway in the Michaud building. With a device like this, you just aim it towards the wall and it counts openings, it finds the intersecting corridor for you. Outdoors, you can follow shorelines with some of them. For example, with the Sonic Guide or with its successor, the K device, you can actually shoreline by listening to the sound of the grass. It's mushy, the sidewalk will have a hard sound. You can keep that in your mind and project a line of travel. Drop-off location, only one device had it, and that's the laser cane. But wouldn't that be wonderful if all devices could do that? All right, here's a chart that I think is an interesting chart. This was a chart that I had developed for inclusion in the Foundations of O&M textbook, but it became just too cumbersome to include and too difficult to interpret. But so it really was not a chart that we really made use of. But it has some interesting information. It has the cost of the devices, and it classifies them by primary or secondary. Notice that the primary devices are in essence the Ultra cane because it is built into the cane, and the laser cane. We have put the case sonar device as a secondary device. Even though it can be mounted on a cane, it's not that useful on a cane. So study this chart. It's kind of interesting. The hand guide that I've talked about, $79. Not so bad. There's even a newer device called the Ray. We haven't looked at as much, but it's an inexpensive device as well. So we have to keep our eyes open to see just what comes out. And we may find new things all of the time. So these are the devices. The Sonic Guide, when it was available, was $6,000. So you can imagine that couldn't have been terribly popular at that kind of a price range. All right, finally, I want to talk about why I think there's been a lack of acceptance of these ETAs, even though I find them to be really helpful, and many people do find them helpful. First of all, difficulty of interpreting the information. The devices that are really sophisticated and really give us great information are the devices that take an awful lot of training. They're hard to interpret. And so sometimes people don't want to put that kind of energy and training into learning how to use them. Second of all, interference with existing environmental sounds. We know how important the traffic is. It's paramount. And if the devices interfere, it becomes a real problem. I think multitasking is involved with this. Can you listen to all the sound that's around you and listen to the devices at the same time? Could be a problem. The cost of the devices and the lack of coverage by the government or by agencies or by schools becomes a real problem for many people. Another one is the added attention that these devices might bring to the user. Think about that for a second. You're wearing something around your neck, or you're wearing something on your head. Is that really, is it worth it? People will look at you, people wonder, what is that? A lot of people really have objected to wearing the devices for that reason. Another problem is lack of a drop-off detection. Without being able to detect drop-offs, I mean, that's what everybody's really worried about. It's drop-offs. So not as useful as they could be. Reliability is another problem. Some of them would break down on a regular basis. Others were more reliable. But the more sophisticated, the more likely something will go wrong with them. Another is use in adverse weather conditions. If you've got rain, if you've got snow, they interfere with the beams that the device sends out. And so you get false information. Another reason could be that to teach the use of these devices, mobility specialists, comms, have to really be trained themselves. And while we at one point in time had special classes to train comms, we don't see too many of them. Mostly now we find that they occur at AER conferences. And sometimes just the attitude of the comms could be in the way, thinking that it's just too much to think about, too difficult to use. So that explains where we currently are, where we have been, and who knows, in the future we may see devices developed that are much better, that give us the kind of information that we really seek and that are not too expensive. So I think we're always on the lookout to see what might develop in the future.